The effects of the marker and the alterations to the body that it causes therein is an absolute process. As a person exists longer in the presence of the marker signal, their body will begin to twist and alter, but not before the mind finally fails. In this process, all humanity is lost, and they are driven to extreme acts of aggression when they are still in their hominid form. But as the signal begins changing how the brain functions, eventually this will lead to them to ultimately take themselves out, or in a rage, be taken out by someone else. Honestly, if you take Toxoplasmosis gondii and compare it to the marker, it's almost a little bit similar, isn't it? For those that aren't aware, Toxoplasmosis gondii causes rodents to become attracted to the scent of cat urine, and as a result, this will actually result in them being eaten, to which the parasite can then transfer to the cat to continue its life cycle. It also causes behavioral changes and causes them to not stick to the corners of rooms and under brush or logs, and instead wander out into the open to be scooped up by like an owl or other bird of prey. The point to this is the behavior of the animal changes as the mind is altered, and this is only to the benefit of what infected the creature initially. Actually, interestingly enough, the same parasite, which if you've watched this channel before you probably already know this, makes humans attracted to the smell of cat urine as well, which is why people who actually hoard cats typically are infected with this parasite. In terms of the marker, the same process of causing the person to take themselves out, or in other ways go after others to be taken out, requires fundamental changes in the brain. These changes could be as simple as decreased activity in some areas and increased activities in others. But the human mind can actually be stubbornly resilient as well, it seems. With some, the marker process takes only a couple of hours, but for others, it seems as though not only are they resistant to the marker's effects, but they can outright be immune to it, which in turn can create an area of effect the marker signal is not able to penetrate, making those that are being affected by the signal effectively shielded from the marker by being close enough to that person. This was actually seen in Lexine Weller in Dead Space Extraction during the initial outbreak on the mining colony Aegis 7. With that said, you can be resistant to the marker all you'd like, but even this abnormality appears to have been planned by the creatures that control the marker. If a species you are trying to assimilate has immune individuals, then that could spell disaster, as it would give too many a chance to destroy the marker and thus ruin your chances of absorbing the species in a convergence event. If the species was left in its original form, then it may not be formidable enough to take on this other species' law enforcement or military strength, which even further hurts the chances of them being overrun. So again, they would have to be changed in some sort of way beyond just driven to become the biomass observed all over the walls as the corruption. They would need to essentially be drones, stalking and looking for not only survivors, but also those that might be resistant to the marker's effects, if not outright immune. As a person slowly begins to hallucinate in the presence of the marker, this would present a horrifying existence in reality to that individual. It depends on what you personally believe concerning if we're the sum of our parts or something more, but one thing is certain. Our brain entering a period of dysfunction can inspire a cascade of stress responses that ironically help the marker further its goal towards you changing. Those first hallucinations, the whispering in the shadow, the person walking by in the corner of your eye, eventually all those come front and center. Many people who recorded their experiences would say that when they were near the marker or working on it, noted that it started simply enough, but eventually it would go on to become very blatant that the person was basically hallucinating. They began seeing loved ones who had already passed for any reason on cameras or down at the end of hallways. Eventually these hallucinations began to speak to them and would tell them to do terrible things. In fact, we know on Titan Station that even the younglings would be affected to the point that they would become aggressive during recess as their invisible friend would tell them to do things. For adults, if enough time passed, this could result in a horrific change in perception. Back on Aegis 7, a man by the name of Sam Caldwell was working as a miner when he began to get attacked, and I use that term loosely. It may have been possible that someone else was succumbing to the signal and he was further along than Sam was, but then he had to fight his way out of the mines. It became apparent though that once law enforcement showed up, he was actually the one that was losing it. The innocents in front of him were just regular people, either trying to stop him or get out of his way, but the marker signal sent him into a deep state of psychosis to the point that he saw necros attacking him. Eventually, he was put down, approaching the elevator because he was the one who was stacking bodies for the marker. The hallucination's end goal is to get you to create biomass. It does this by affecting your perception, which leads to an increase in cortisol and the disruption of neurochemicals in your brain typically released in rhythms of your daily activity. Once this is accomplished, Cortisol will continue to rise in your body, as well as adrenaline, as the brain struggles to make sense of the world around it and the monsters that it perceives. This also begins to affect your ability to sleep, with even medicine not being able to put you down because your body is just so amped up, and this can further decrease your resilience. Once this stage has been reached, the person is incredibly difficult to control because they are in a state of constant fight or flight. If they choose fight, then you get the Sam situation. If you choose run, then you're more likely to end up falling in the hands of another person who's also losing it. The third option, after enough time has passed and the voices have become too loud, is self-elimination to escape the situation that they are in. Intelligence is said to affect the process, which is actually fairly interesting. Again, we know with Isaac that he is resistant to a degree, but not immune. I've stated in other videos, though, that I thought Ellie was outright immune, much like Lexine, but unlike Lexine, she does not have the area of influence, and as a result, Strauss would succumb to the marker influence despite being near her most of the time on Titan Station. But there is an actual structural reason for resilience. I believe I covered this slightly in my last Dead Space video, but that got age restricted, of course. Even though after it was confirmed suitable, it's very odd. So I don't think many of you actually saw that I released that video. But let's go into it for a moment, and don't worry, we are getting to the slashers here in a second. I'm just kind of setting the stage. But before we get too deep into that, I want to say thank you for all the support that I've gotten over on the Roanoke Tales channel, talking about real-life horror. I should have another video out this week. Also, a lot of people requested that they wanted this in podcast format, since it was more talking about just actual events of like horrific portions of history. So I did get those uploaded. It should be on like, I mean, everybody says this, but like all major podcast things like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, it's called Real Horror with Roanoke is the name if anybody's interested, but we're going to move on. People with higher levels of cognitive ability tend to be able to cope better with a wide range of challenges in their jobs and in their life in general. Isaac is said to be an engineer who thinks on the fly and can produce solutions with very little information. And I mean, that sort of explains like how he's running around the ship fixing everything that was broken despite all the other engineers failing. This type of mental processing and ability would denote an active frontal lobe. It should also be noted that there is a cerebello-parietal component related to intelligence as well. So basically the frontal lobe and parietal lobes, that's where your ability to like learn, understand, and use that information effectively is located. Knowing this, having a resilient brain is actually due to a legitimate structure in the brain. In the prefrontal cortex, this area is known to help you process difficult things around you, and as a result, your behaviors will match the outcome of that. Those that have less activity in this area, or have it altered through potentially like a traumatic brain injury, will lose this ability to control their emotions as effectively, and we have seen this in a man named Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage lived between July 1823 and then met his end in May of 1860. He was an American Railroad construction foreman at the time, and due to some faulty TNT that he was packing, an iron rod was blasted up through his jaw and out the top of his head. Everybody thought like this dude was completely done the second it happened, but he ended up surviving. Prior to this incident, he is said to have been very level-headed and a good leader. He would break up disagreements between workers and was able to mediate quite well. However, when the rod went through his head, it severed the connection of his brain and most of his frontal lobe. As he recovered, it became clear that he was a different person entirely. His emotional regulation was completely gone. At a whim, he would oscillate between happy to sad to angry, then back to happy once again, and all within like the same minute. Any news about anything could set him off in an instant. At the time, very little was known about the brain, but we now know that the portion of his brain responsible for emotional regulation as well as mental resilience was cut off from the rest of the brain, rendering him this way. So here we have an example of what happens when the brain is cut off from the prefrontal cortex, emotional dysregularity to an extreme degree. I believe when the marker attacks the mind, this area of the brain is also subdued, but not completely or all at once. To shut down an area of the brain would likely mean that the signal is also shutting down the whole brain, which at that point, yes, I mean, they become corruption, which honestly may be the better process if you don't really think about it. But for anyone immune, they could then go and destroy the markers, which in turn would ruin the plan and basically cause the corruption that formed to just fall into a soupy DNA everywhere, as mentioned in the Ishimura before on Titan Station when they found it. Or anybody who was just kind of like comatose would wake back up at the conclusion of this. So I believe the markers take the approach of decreased activity, but do not stop the activity entirely. Because of this, those that have a higher functioning prefrontal cortex indicated by their intelligence are able to regulate this marker signal better. And while they may become altered in some ways, such as hallucinating people, hearing whispers, or in general, seeing marker code in their vision, they do not completely have their ability to regulate their emotions behind it taken away or lose their grasp on reality. And this is seen when Isaac struggles with issues the longer he's on the Ishimura, but never fully falls to the marker despite him being manipulated by it. This is also seen with the more intelligent crew members who are left over, such as Dr. Kine, whose regulation of emotions is actually seen when they first find the marker, and he's like not ecstatic about it, but the captain and Dr. Mercer were. I mean, even to a degree, Mercer himself, while he was manipulated like everyone else, he did not off himself. So that kind of indicates that he was resistant as well. Although he was doing some like horrendous stuff, as well as concerning Brant Harris and turning him into the hunter, which we will definitely be going over in a video in the future. But what happens when a person does not have the increased ability to regulate emotions? What if their brain is running on normal mode? Because remember, most of us fall into a range of averages concerning our intelligence, our skeletons, our muscle mass, our fat content, and our emotions. Because over time, these were the most effective that led to our survival. So this is just simply natural selection. However, because the black marker influencing all of humanity's evolution in the Dead Space universe, all of this was controlled by the black marker from the time that mammals were scurrying back into their dens and underfoot of the dinosaurs when the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula. Because of this, things were built into the human evolutionary process that could be switched on or off when the marker would cause the planet to be harvested and the apex species assimilated. So side note, I would also say it was known by the marker that there would still be outliers during this time period because of what we're about to talk about. Those that have regular minds have them downgraded to the point that they lose the ability to regulate. And once this happens, their assimilation into the biomass is all but assured should others not succeed in preventing it. But it really doesn't matter to that individual at that point because they've already gotten like consumed by everything around us, so it doesn't really matter. But this results in something known as the slasher. As the outbreak continues and the bodies get stacked at the hands of those that are either hallucinating or acting aggressively, not on purpose, but because they are pushed to, or even the people that are resistant that are trying to like keep others away from them, something begins to happen. See, the marker does not appear to be able to completely change living tissue into one at once. Instead, it requires the brain to be shut down entirely or infected entirely. Think of it like two things vying for control of the body. The brain, being naturally occurring, would like to keep the current set of circumstances. The marker needs the brain out of the way in order to fully control the body and alter it. This sort of brings up the idea that the brain itself somehow has the ability to either weaken or denigrate the effects of the marker naturally, as through the evolutionary process, it was not able to completely change the brain entirely. And this was kind of a basis I had that a naturally occurring species kind of lives harmoniously with the actual planet that it lives on, but then the marker species obviously is driven to consume more and more, so it needs to leave its planet and spread out. But because it comes from that naturally occurring animal that was already there, it does have still somewhat of those roots that possibly make it more resistant. But the existence of the brain in the first place, this sort of makes the marker need to work and then push humanity to spread. So there is some resistance, I believe, to the marker. It's just varying degrees. So we're gonna like way sidetrack. I could go on about that for hours because that's like philosophical, but to me, it's more than likely. So once the brain is overcome, the body will begin to alter into the first form, again known as the slasher. And from here, the marker will permeate into the tissue more deeply as it alters its communication and subsequently the structures that make up the body to create the monsters that have way more offensive capabilities than the average person would have. The slasher itself is formed from just one person who has met their end. Because they are first to get up and form, they then create more of them. They are then more standard during the beginning of the outbreak. As the process continues, though, other variants and other forms of necromorphs will come into play, with even the slasher eventually being hardened into a stronger form known as the enhanced necromorph or enhanced slasher. So before getting into what the internal changes to the body are, we first have to take a look at their physical morphology, which, oh man, talk about getting to like the absolute basics of this channel, where it all started from and why this channel gets dunked on as like a foot thing masquerading as a video game science channel. You just gotta lean into the memes sometimes. Starting with the feet, we see a few things have changed from the original to the remake. In fact, quite a few things are different, but what makes it awesome is because there's actually a lot more stuff to analyze. The feet have been lengthened quite a bit to roughly about 1.5 times their original size of the original foot, and this is because of the new sprouting toes that have come off on the front of the foot. The toes sit at the front, and with the third one on the back holding them up, it's much like a heel that's attached to the heel. making the foot now more digitigrade in structuring rather than the plantigrade that humans usually have. But what's more interesting is the toes sprouting, well, okay, I guess you can call them toes, but really they just appear to be protrusions more than anything. These protrusions will continue on up the leg to just around above the new ankle area. And this seems that this is here to like stabilize or attempt to stabilize anyways, which generally makes sense as the genetic coding that is formed during your gestational period would have basically had the information of sprouting toes, which is similar to fingers, and that's all going to be located in this area. Moving up to the legs, we see the creatures have a bit of an ungainly gait. Due to the structural changes of the legs, this has caused them to move more carefully, which is a drawback, but that doesn't matter because they're still capable of occasionally running at a high rate of speed, using the arms as a counterbalance with every step in order to stay upright. The legs have not increased in size as much, but as we move to the thigh and pelvic region, we begin to see something interesting. The angle at which the femur attaches to the pelvis has dramatically changed, and this would also change drastically how the slasher walks by association. Bone shape entirely, as well as the socket connections, have been altered, which I think it's because, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but I've noticed that the slashers, because of their hunched over appearance, because of how the arms are changed, and because of how the legs are changed, it kind of seems like there's like a template for a quadrupedal animal being applied to the human form, which makes them appear this way. Anyways, getting back to the pelvis, it has increased in size to about 1.5 times its original size, which is fairly interesting. A larger pelvis does not seem all that necessary, so this would denote things like the bone itself being increased in size and the density as a result of the transformation process. This can also be seen when we move around to the back of the creature. It would seem to me that the signal intrinsically knows where the weak points of the human body are, at least to some degree, as the vertebral column has been bolstered with extra bone, to the point that it now has to come out of the skin and has formed a visible protrusion, and they are much larger than a normal human vertebrae. Moving back to the abdomen, well, this is going to definitely get me screwed, but it's basically just guts. Now, typically, I would think these were vestigial because originally there was really nothing about them in the original game to make you think any different. So they just really have no purpose. But I don't believe that this is totally the case anymore. In some of the infected slashers we see, much like with the exploders, their guts actually have a certain level of bioluminescence to them, and this indicates that the viral bacteria that arrives with the marker infection is also present here. Why is it a viral bacteria? I actually have an episode on that. If you'd like to see it, just type in Dead Space viral bacteria on this channel. I know viruses and bacteria are different organisms. I'm actually a microbiologist. I had somebody get really just bent out of shape that I chose like that adjective to describe the bacteria what I was doing at the time. It was just very odd. Like he wrote me like a dissertation. But anyways, it seems the intestines will now be a breeding ground for this specific bacteria, which calls into question if the viral bacteria is actually the leftover gut microbiome of the person and is also influenced by the marker. Well, I mean, it really wouldn't be that far-fetched to think about it that way because we know there isn't like a specific species barrier in which the marker signal can affect. I mean, it took over the Tau Volantians. They were aliens. It took over the military dogs in Dead Space 3. I mean, they're mammals, but they're definitely not human. And it takes over humans, and it's very clearly taken over a ton of other species based on how many Brethren moons there actually are. The abdomen also sports everyone's favorite, tiny arms. These arms creep me out every time. So these arms are typically used for two purposes. Should the legs be taken out from underneath the slasher, these can help keep it upright and then throw it upwards in the air while it slashes with its main arms. Or if it draws you in, they give you a tiny little hug. God, I don't know, it's just, they creep me out, man. Anyhow, moving up to the torso, not much has changed, although I also wonder if the lungs are affected on the same level as the intestines. The shoulder joints have been cracked into place and altered, much like the hips are, which has raised the arms almost perpendicular to the original shoulder plane. Because of this, the elbows sit much higher than the head. But this is also because the head has been pushed forward and down, likely due to the spinal growth that the slasher has undergone. And this, again, gives it almost the appearance that it wants to be quadrupedal, but is walking on two legs. The forearms have also grown to about double their original length, and the hands have been elongated. Coming out of the hands, sharp blades now burst from the palms, which are used in an offensive manner. And then rounding back the last time to the quadrupedal comment, these blades can also be used to stabilize the slasher, which actually, to a degree, would make it at least partially quadrupedal. These blades are thick enough to smash against metal and not shatter, but have a bladed edge that can cut through most materials, such as the human body, as well as regular clothing and some heavier fabrics. And judging by Isaac's suit, they are also sharp enough to gouge out the metal as they hit it, but this is also because of the strength that the slashers possess. So first off, let me talk about motive real quick, the guys who remade this game. If you guys see this, it's a freaking chef's kiss of a design. You guys did awesome. The other day, I had some dude basically say that I couldn't think this was a 10 out of 10 game for myself personally, just because there were game elements I liked. Like, if you're watching this, bro, what are you even saying? Like, the game elements are what make the game. Like, I mean, yeah, the story is, I mean, I love the story anyways, but the game elements, that's the fun part. Anyways, huge bra moment. So, we get to see more of the necromorphs due to the peeling away that we can actually achieve by using a force blaster. And trust me, I want to say what it actually is, but I also like buying groceries. Although, let's be honest, this video, again, is 9 out of 10 going to get wrecked by the age issue, so I don't even know what I'm talking about. Complaining aside, using the force handheld, peeling off the skin, we can see the muscular structures are relatively the same, which will be important in a moment. The muscle size also does not seem to be increased all that much either, if at any. Blasting a slasher again, we see the deeper muscle tissues underneath still remain firmly attached to the skeleton after the top layer has already been lost, which indicates something quite interesting to me. With the deeper muscle layers as well as tendons and ligaments, this could point to the possibility that these connections to the bone have been bolstered, which, if we know the bone itself is growing and increasing in density, that would indicate that the softer tissues may actually be further integrated into the bone structure itself, now giving it the ability to hold on with greater strength. And this would have the effect of making the slasher able to survive hits that would massively damage a person, such as, I don't know, a hit from a plasma cutter. And it could also possibly explain why it's able to hit so hard but not destroy its own body. Newton's third law states that for every action or force in nature, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If object A exerts a force or anything on object B, then object B also exerts an equal and opposite force on object A. When the slasher hits Isaac, he may get cut in half or lose a limb, but those exact forces are also operating on the limb of the slasher. Sort of like when you get into a fist fight, you can easily damage your limbs as well by landing a blow on the other person. Those forces go into that person's body, but they also go back into your body as well. The slasher, with its ability to dismantle a person back to their factory components, means that those same forces are rattling through the bones and warping the tissue of the tendons, muscle, and ligaments as well. But it appears as though they are more securely attached, and as a result, they do not degrade or break like a human body does. The exterior appearance of a slasher indicates that the body itself had met its end and is reanimated, which we'll kind of talk about the whole reanimation thing here in a moment and how it's possible, but moving up to the head, the skin is ashen and gray, its face is gaunt and pale. The eyes have sunken into the head, and the cornea and actual irises and pupils themselves in general have turned a sickly yellow color. This yellow color is also a type of bioluminescence, indicating that the brain is likely experiencing the same perfusion of infection that is present in the intestines. This infection actually links the brain to the marker and subsequently to the species that controls the marker. See, it's hypothesized that the Brethren moons, or the things that control them, because the moon itself is simply a conduit for the creatures, can see everything that a necromorph sees. The only reason they don't show up and just absorb everything right then and there is because the universe is quite expansive and they actually have no idea where you are, and they need the convergence event to start, which kind of signals them and will alert them to a species' presence, which then they can form a new link. So, how do the slashers actually get up post-mortem and walk around? Well, the interesting thing about a person meeting their end is it's not 100% their end at that moment. Usually. So like if you took a nuke going off, yeah, that's like 100% of you is done at that moment. But if it's like a wound or a natural cause, once you pass on, a lot of your body is still alive. And even past that, cells may run out of metabolic energy and shut down, but for like a short period of time, that can be returned to them. But even then, in the presence of the marker, none of that is necessary. As the signal drifts through the ship or through the planet or through wherever you are, the station, anyone who loses control of their body by one way or another will shift from internal metabolisms utilizing ATP or adenosine triphosphate to using the energy gained by the marker signal. It appears that through the evolutionary process of humans on Earth in the Dead Space universe, the marker made the animals of Earth capable of using the marker's energy in place of a metabolism in some instances. Now, the black marker itself does not seem to offer this energy, but it does offer like a different form of the energy. So instead, it implanted in the cellular DNA of humans the ability to use the marker signal or use its energy. So on Earth, humans are reliant on chemical energy because the marker, again, does not offer what they need, because that would just kind of screw everything up. And there would not be enough biomass to start a convergence event that soon. However, once humans build the red marker out of bismuth, it's clear something else happened. See, the energy is there in the black marker, but it appears changed somehow, and this is likely because the black marker itself does not want to influence the species on that level. Scientists were stated as saying, it's like it wants us to build it. Well, it does, but it wanted you to build it differently than the original marker, which as a result would put the energy out needed to corrupt and change the body and steal away the metabolic pathway for survival. A lot of people seem to think that the marker was like against the necromorphs somehow, and this was kind of like a confusing thing in the first game, but really the marker wants necromorphs. It just is lying to everybody around it. So the marker, they thought they were studying it and then learning about it and like, oh, everything's good. This is how we do this. This is really easy. But really the marker, the black marker specifically on Earth, was just kind of lying to them saying, oh yeah, you need to build it this way, even though I'm built this way. I guess you could say the black marker was literally just built different. So once a person is done so, the marker's energy will then reanimate the cell by taking over the metabolism and also influencing the genetics of the person. And this will cause the body to then, again, reanimate over a period of time. Slowly at first, but eventually the person will get back up. The other process that we have seen with Captain Matthias is way more brutal. If an infector can directly inject the viral bacteria into the brain, it will quickly cause that bacteria to spread through the rest of the body, possibly by jump-starting the heart, considering the proboscis is likely going all the way to the brainstem, shocking the heart back into action. Because, also, remember, while the captain was gone, the cells are still receiving that energy from the red marker on board, just really low levels of it, and all the cells were still likely functional to a degree and alive. Once the bacteria spreads, it quickly alters the body into the slasher in just a few moments as opposed to hours with just a signal alone. Because of this, and I need to tell you this is off the lore, but having looked at the lore lately and also back in the day, a lot of what I say ends up there, at least in the wikis, which is absolutely baller. But this also explains what was said in the remake, which is also pretty awesome. An audio log questions if cutting off the limbs actually ends the necros or just incapacitates them. Well, if low-level energy hypothesis is to be believed, then they are just incapacitated at that moment. They can still bite your ankle if you walked by. Given enough time from there, they will either regrow limbs, or if others are incapacitated near them, they would then kind of turn into other necromorphs, such as the Brute. So who's to say that wasn't just like a group of slashers put down by security early in an outbreak that created the Brute that you first run into on the bridge? And that is why you always light them up with fire whenever you see one on the ground, because even with Isaac's Might of Zeus stomp, they could turn back into the corruption or form new limbs from other tissue in their body, which was actually occasionally seen with the intestines forming rudimentary arms, or they could just turn into something way worse, like the Tormentor or the Brute, or basically anything terrible. So finally, we get to, how does the slasher take you out? You know that one time that you went to the club and there was that one woman who latched onto your neck, and by the time you got out of there, it looked like Mike Tyson had like punched you multiple times in the neck? Well, it's like that, except with teeth. No, wait a minute. No, it's the same. The Slagathor will latch onto Isaac's neck, clubwoman style, and start digging into it. It appears to get a strong enough hold and a deep enough hold into the tissue to wrench to the side, which severs Isaac's spine and connecting muscle. This results in the head coming completely off the top of the shoulders, which results in an immediate end. What's worse, if the French are anything to go off of with the French guillotine stuff, you're alive for like a few seconds after that. So then the stalker hits you center mass with its blades on its hand because it's never heard of overkill before. Now, Isaac's counter to this is to shove it away like I should have done, and that's where the similarities end, because the next part involves showing the slasher some good old-fashioned hand-to-hand combat that humanity was raised on. Basically, at this point, just go goblin mode on it and make the species that controls the Brotherhood of Moons aware that humanity still has that dog in them. Well, anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. Really enjoyed covering some more Dead Space, but I suppose we'll see what happens on the old YouTube moderation front. Gonna be real here, not great odds. But anyhow, if you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great. Subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Roanoke Tales channel, and podcast links in the description. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astronaut, Wesley A. Weaver Jr. Thanks, Prometheus. I'd also like to thank our astrophysicist, Des Dancer, as well as our scientists, Countryside Limbo, Lacune, and Logan Satomi. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running, especially with stuff like this, and is greatly appreciated. Alright, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.